anyone is considering a monastic vocation, I don't think they're looking for Club Med. I don't think they're looking for a resort. They're looking for something different, something challenging, something risky that will enable them, maybe even accelerate them and fast track them to their eternal reward. And so I'm not saying monks welcomed the Vikings and saw them as, the kind of an opportunity for martyrdom, you know. But I think maybe some of them anyways accepted it as part. Maybe this is a reason why they went back, that if this is what God calls them to do, and if this is what God sees as how they should live their lives, they should trust in God. And that's what Alcuin, going back to his letter, he advises his monks to do, excuse me, not his monks. He advises the monks of Britain to do two things: to defend themselves. He says that, defend themselves, to take confidence, to defend themselves and trust in God. And it's really interesting what the defend themselves means. Is he saying pick up a staff and hit them with it? Or does he mean kind of like morally defend yourself and spiritually defend yourself? I find it fascinating.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Vikingology,
the art and science of the Viking Age.
I'm Thing 1, CJ Adrian.
And I'm Thing 2, Terry Barnes.
And today we have a very special guest.
Yes, we do. We're very excited to welcome Dr. Matthew Pinessi of Ohio Dominican University to tell us all about monasteries.
Ooh, monasteries. Most people would not imagine that to be a very exciting topic, but we are a Viking podcast.
Yeah, right. We'll get there. We'll promise there's some sexy stuff in there somewhere.
Yeah, we could call it that.
Yeah. Monasteries were important, as we know, right, for the raiding in the West, and so Matthew will help us figure out why that is.
All right, well, let's dive in.
Okay, great. So, Matt, you specialize in Frankish monasteries, and that is, we're talking about a period of time, mostly 8th and 9th century, as I understand it, correct?
That's correct, yeah.
And, we've talked about this before. This is smack in the middle of the Viking Age, and particularly the 9th century is pretty intense in Francia for Viking activity. And so we wanted to give the audience a little bit of a sense about why these places known as monasteries would have been attractive to Vikings. But so we back up a little bit and say, what is a monastery, Matt? And what got you interested in them?
Right. Well, it's funny. My sort of academic concentration, I'm not saying it was accidental, but it was not a kind of a direct route. When I first started studying the Middle Ages seriously, I didn't think, oh, monks, I want to do monks and monasteries. In fact, way back in the day, I thought that, the Middle Ages was just all knights and battles and kings and, a lot of political history, high Middle Ages. I didn't think I would be within kind of the misty centuries of, continental France. It was sort of a gradual process. And in fact, a lot of my concentration and focus was directed by my trepidation. And by that, I mean, when it comes to research, I don't like feeling overwhelmed. I don't like feeling overwhelmed by the sheer amount of sources and languages. And, I like to keep things manageable. So a lot of my interest in the early Middle Ages was driven by, what at the time I thought was a scarcity of sources, and the fact that most of those sources were Latin. And in fact, I did kind of enjoy studying a period that, maybe could be described as a little less centralized. So in terms of kind of my chronological boundaries and why I'm kind of in the 8th century, the 8th and 9th century is kind of where I drew the line. I said my advisors kept kind of encouraging me you ever want a job, you need to, show your versatility. You need to, you can't be stuck in late antiquity. You can't be stuck in the early Middle Ages. You have to be marketable. Now, at my university, I don't think anyone on my hiring committee would have known the difference between early, and late medieval, Carolingian, Merovingian. These aren't distinctions that kind of exist at some smaller universities. But no, so my chronological focus on the early Middle Ages is really just kind of an offshoot of, I at the time wanted to I not feel overwhelmed. And also I kind of like exploring mysteries, and I thought, well, the early Middle Ages, there's lots of gaps and lots of blanks that need to be filled, and so that's kind of what put my focus there. As far as monasticism, I guess I've always been interested in spirituality and just kind of how countercultural the monastic life is and was. And so I became interested in monks right from the beginning, right, with Saint Anthony of Egypt, and just kind of how they would renounce the world, would move into the desert, and live in community, and live and not honestly be in control of their own lives, but they would, in obedience and humility, kind of give that over to the authority of a leader or an abbot and a rule. So I became very interested in monastic spirituality, the history, church history, and so those two things kind of merged. I said, okay, 8th and 9th century, we'll stay in France, and I'll look at the lives of monks, and that's kind of how it started. So
okay, and then the Vikings are going to come at that period of time and make your life a living hell. What would you
right?
want to
And it's funny when you asked me to be on, and I'm always happy to join, and what little I know, I'm happy to share. I've tried to pretend the Vikings weren't arriving. Everything's good. Everything's, to me, the Carolingians of France, Carolingians, in some respect, represent the first time where we have, a period of great stability and centralization, at least on the surface, and then there's these reports of these Northmen, Northmen are appearing here and there. Well, that's kind of mid-9th century. I could almost kind of cut things off. That's where the Carolingians are beginning to recede.
I'll just pretend.
I've tried not to confront them. I've really tried not to confront the Vikings much in my research. And if it weren't for one or two letters written by Alcuin of York, they really wouldn't intersect at all with my research.
Okay, so Matt, I've shown this to you before, and CJ has seen it as well, but I'm just going to quickly share the screen so our audience can get a sense of the utter chaos that we're talking about here.
I just want to add, the idea that you're ignoring or trying to push off the Vikings a little bit is how very Louis the Pious of you.
Out of sight, out of mind. I do the same now. When it comes to managing a household, and I don't do a whole lot of managing of my household, but I have 3 teenage boys, and honestly, sometimes I prefer not to know what's going on. Just for my sanity. So similarly in my research, I guess.
So look at all, this map, right? I mean, every one of those arrows represents Viking activity in France at the time. Well, just the 9th century, actually, which was the busiest as far as Francia is concerned. And, but look it's coastlines, it's up the River Rhine highways. I mean, they're everywhere. And also, as other scholars I've heard do, I'll do the same thing here. I mean, it's like it's sort of abstract to look at this map, but you have to understand that each one of those arrows represents, utter terror, literally, that is going on in many of these communities. So the Scandinavians were wreaking plenty of havoc at the time. So So describe, I mean, so what is a monastery? I mean, who's living there? I mean, you said monks, but so like, what are these people doing there? Why are these things, why do these institutions exist?
Yeah, these institutions serve, I teach the subject, I research the subject, and just kind of as a preamble in some respect, when I first, got into medieval history, I was fascinated by just how differently people lived. That's what drew me to the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
We live in an age of, well, beyond gunpowder. We live in the age of electricity and modern conveniences. And well, what interests me, many decades ago and still to this day, is an age where people live according to different principles and just different lifestyles. I found that attractive. But now, what's beginning to fascinate me is just how little things have changed. And so when you ask me just what is a monk,
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out, do I answer that from the modern perspective or the medieval perspective? Because in some respect, the compulsion, what draws people to the monastic lifestyle, I think it exists as much today as it did then. We are in workaday world. Our lives are filled with distractions. It's so easy to just lose track of a whole bunch of years and wonder, what have I been doing? I've been involved in the grind. I haven't taken a moment to concentrate on what's important or even identify what's important in my life. And sometimes people like to slow down and maybe even reevaluate the direction that they're going in, because with all of these distractions, it's hard to prioritize what truly we should be prioritizing in our lives. A lot of people feel spiritually just empty, or they were led to believe that the modern world, or the medieval world for that matter, the secular world maybe is the best word for it.
Yeah.
The world's kind of redundant to say it that way, but
Yeah.
that society, if you follow this plan, you will, reap the American dream or the medieval dream. You'll have your house, your picket fence, your security, your stability, and maybe it doesn't deliver. Or if it delivers, maybe it doesn't give you the satisfaction that was promised you. So I think now, and very much back then, people, were kind of reevaluating what's important. And what is important to a lot of people was their spiritual development. That tends to get lost when we're distracted. So monasticism is a movement that develops in response to people wanting to become closer to God and wanting to be able to pray and contemplate and focus on, what is most important. And what's most important, for a lot of medieval monks was their spiritual progression and the achievement of salvation. And they wanted to do it free of distraction. They found that society pulls them down in a lot of ways, and when I teach this to my students, I'm kind of facetious a little bit. Were it not for you people, I wouldn't have such a hard time, developing spiritually. I wouldn't have these temptations. If I didn't see what my neighbor was accumulating, I wouldn't feel envy or maybe greed. If I didn't see people who I found, physically attracted, I wouldn't feel lust. If I wasn't driving to work and you cut me off, I wouldn't feel wrath. I mean, all these temptations, the carnal sins, it means sins of the flesh, they all have their root in society, and pride being the worst of them, that you can live your life according to your way and not God's way. Well, in order to kind of get back on track, it was determined, and Saint Anthony of Egypt was kind of the first in the Western tradition, you could say, who did this, although eremitism, being a hermit, was definitely not unknown at the time. Saint Anthony, he had everything going for him. He was quite well off, and but he felt empty. He felt unfulfilled, and he was passing, actually, I think he went in the church, and he heard the gospel account of the rich man who was told to go sell all of his things and follow. And so that's what Anthony did. And Anthony went into the desert, and renouncing the world is kind of the first step that a monk would take. Renouncing all ties to society in a lot of ways allows a monk, to progress beyond, all of the distractions and temptations and focus on what is most important in life. Now, of course, there are other elements. And I should say right now, St. Anthony failed. St. Anthony failed, as did every single experiment of monasticism. The word itself means the solitary life. Well, show me a monk who lives by him or herself. You can't go anywhere and not encounter people. You also can't go anywhere and not be pulled back into the world. So and you almost necessarily connect with people as part of the human condition. So St. Anthony kind of developed a compromise. In St. Anthony's case, and this is 4th century, in St. Anthony's case, his problem was stories of his great, his great victories over demons and temptation. They were somehow getting back to the world, and people wanted to follow him.
Yeah.
They wanted to kind of do what he was doing. And so he had students, and would-be solitaries follow him into the desert, and he kept sort of saying, okay, and you could imagine him sighing, fine, here, you want some teachings? I'll give you some teachings. Okay, is everyone good? You know what to do. I'm going to go a little bit further into the desert now. See you later. Don't follow me. Went a little bit further into the desert, and they followed him. Well, then he said, okay, here you go. Here's some more, but we're good now, and see ya. And he kept going. And the problem is you could only go halfway into the desert before you start leaving it. You can't go anywhere in the world and truly live a solitary life. So Anthony came up with a compromise that they would physically distance themselves from society, but they would live in common. These would be people who shared their common goals and aspirations to develop spiritually, to live lives of prayer. And eventually in this tradition, they developed rules to follow. It's not enough to, renounce the world. You need structure. You need rules and regulations, and especially you kind of need a program to follow that isn't of your design, because ultimately what monasticism seeks to achieve is cultivate humility. Humility is what will allow us to overcome our own pride and live the life God wants us to. In monastic communities, the primary occupation is prayer, and the day is divided into various hours of prayer and singing praise to God, using the book of the Psalms, using the Psalter is primarily what monks were occupied in. But you had to sustain these communities, so work was a necessary component. And if you have to sustain these communities through work, well, you would want financial independence. You did not want to depend on the outside world. So you would need to maybe sell goods and services. So monasteries were never, very far away from the world in some respects, because monasteries were dependent on them. So essentially, that's what a monk aspired to do, to live a life closer to God, to kind of suppress the carnality in their lives and the propensity to be tempted and to sin, so that they could almost free their soul to kind of rise and ascend to the contemplation of the divine.
Okay, so I'll push back a little bit then on the renunciation, and especially, of the world, right? Especially in the context of Vikings, right? Because, of course, the story about the Viking raids, ostensibly on many of these places, was that they're easy targets for wealth, portable wealth. And sometimes, as we know, that takes the form of like the actual monks themselves, right? Because the Vikings were slavers. And so it's captive human beings. But we also know that it's a lot of other blingy stuff, right? The golds and the silvers and the manuscripts that can be ransomed and all of this. And so then how do you reconcile renunciation of worldly things with the fact that these things, these places, these little communities seem to be targets for like, ooh, wealth, let's go there.
Yeah. And in the Middle Ages, monasteries, that it was the wealthiest institution. Monasteries controlled most of the arable land, and in fact, monasteries. We talk about how monks sought to renounce the world. Well, the world followed monasteries. In fact, cities and towns developed around monasteries. Monasteries controlled a vast amount of wealth. A monk wouldn't own any personal property. What a monk used was distributed according to necessity. Now, one of my research specialties is monastic rules, regulations, and customaries. You frequently see in this attempts to delineate what a monk should use, which tells you that monks were probably, had access to more than that. So collectively a monastery might be quite wealthy, but monks individually would not own anything in their possession. Not even a bar of soap or ointment, not the slippers, not the cloaks or the robes. That would be monastic property and it would be theirs to use. But yes, the community had wealth. So it's interesting when it comes to the Vikings, were monasteries just these undefended treasure houses? That's kind of the issue. And I think in a lot of respect, our understanding of monasteries being a target of the Vikings might have its genesis in the attack on Lindisfarne. When monasteries attacked Britain, they of course went for coastal regions, and first at least. And monasteries, because of a monk's kind of desire to renounce the world, monasteries tended to be located far away from urban centers. They might have a village around them, but and so I think it's sort of an easy assumption or supposition to just assume, because of how earth-shattering that attack was. I mentioned Alcuin of York and how he was told of this attack on Lindisfarne, and we don't actually have a copy of his letter. The letter, I think, was sent from a bishop describing what happened, and we don't have that description of the attack that Alcuin received. He responds to it, but
Right.
He's devastated. He's devastated, and in fact, in some ways, he likens it. He doesn't say it specifically, but when I read his description of it, I kind of think of St. Augustine and his response to the fall of Rome in 410 AD, that it changed the world. It just resonated. So if I take that letter and I take what happened at Lindisfarne, I kind of just assume, Vikings, monasteries, coastal regions, this was a deliberate objective, that Vikings might have been almost lured. Why? Because monasteries had wealth. Well, what is the form of monastic wealth that we assume? The very first thing are the vessels used in the liturgy. The liturgy of the Mass. We're talking the chalices and the patens and the ciboria, which necessarily have to be made of precious metals. I honestly, I don't think that's changed in the Roman Catholic Church. That the vessels used in the liturgy of the Mass and the consecration of the bread and the wine, they need to be precious. You can't just use, a beautiful piece of crystal. It needs to be silver or metal, and at least that's my understanding of it. Which was the case in the Middle Ages. So these would be valuable, and monks, in addition to prayer, would be at Mass, would be participating in these liturgies. So we know that monasteries had that. monasteries might have had a certain amount of, quote unquote cash for transactions, to acquire the goods that they needed. They did not produce everything they needed. They sometimes invited craftspeople into the monastery, but if there was a village nearby, they would go out and acquire the goods that they needed. So there might have been some store of money, but likely not very much. Another type of wealth we think of when we think of monasteries, and I've noticed, I run an Instagram account, which and all I do is I do kind of silly humor on it. And it's amazing that anybody is even interested in humor mixed with the Middle Ages, but it's a small niche of humor.
Monty Python, man, come on.
Okay, you know what? Exactly. They were kind of setting a standard that I'm aspiring. So on this account, if I make some sort of comment that I think is funny, it might get some likes. But there is one, if ever I'm out of ideas. And imagine that what I did was just driven by likes. If all I did, if I didn't have a job, if I wasn't, teaching at a university, and I was dependent on social media for my lifestyle, my life, if that was my money source of my life, and all I needed to do was get likes, everything I would post would be about the Library of Alexandria. Everything. The world is just fascinated with the destruction of the Library of Alexandria. It's interesting. I don't. It's not that I don't know why that is. It's we all have this nostalgia about the Library of Alexandria, which is funny because we weren't around then. In fact, scholars don't even know really when it was destroyed, to what extent it was destroyed, how much of it was destroyed. But everyone seems to respond to anything about the Library of Alexandria. What a loss, what a loss. The storehouse of knowledge. Well, the reason why I talked about that, when we hear about the destruction of Lindisfarne, when we think of the treasure, we think Lindisfarne was a monastic center that was famous for its production of manuscripts and codices. And so I think and these are priceless books. We've seen, the Gospels and just the decorations and the designs and, manuscripts are treasures. So I think there's an immediate connection. Okay, monasteries are undefended, which is a point we should go back to. Are monasteries in fact undefended? I think that's a question we should talk about in a sec. But in terms of what were Vikings seeking, if they were lured, to use that word, I loved it, by the way, when I saw the title. What were they seeking? We tend to think if monasteries have treasure at all, it is they're in their vast libraries, the storehouse of knowledge. In some respect, it's true. These are treasures. Manuscripts are treasures. They are priceless, but that's priceless by our standard. So I think we need to be a little more materialistic if we're trying to assess the relative value of a manuscript. And of course, if we are just looking at the materials of a manuscript, they are extremely valuable. The amount of vellum. Now, vellum meaning the pages of a manuscript. Just to acquire the amount of pages, folios of a manuscript, you would need, I don't want to make up a number.
Couple hundred sheep.
Yeah, exactly. A herd of sheep. Now, the skin of the animals would have been a byproduct of various other industries, food industries, milk industries, etc. But they have a lot of value. And then the process of taking essentially a piece of leather and turning it into a page is absolutely laborious. It needs to
Actually, let me just insert right here. We will put in our description a link to, there's a really good video, just 6-minute video that I show my students that you're familiar with, right? That the Getty Museum, which also has a world-class collection of medieval manuscripts, but it's about how to make a medieval book, and it goes through this entire process. And it always gives my students a good idea of like why these things were so valuable, and also why literacy rates were so low, because clearly only rich people could have ever afforded to have a book commissioned, right? Yeah.
And so, the stretching of the vellum and the treating the denuding it of all of the hair, and then once it's ready to go, and then you would fold it, and then you would assemble it into kind of a book form, and then you would sew it together, and then you would begin. Then you would begin to line the page and prick the page, and then you would take the ink, and the ink itself is extremely valuable and hard to produce. It's called encaustum. It's acidic. I'm not saying it's hard to come by, because the most simple types of inks were probably just sort of soot and resin.
Charcoal. Yeah.
But then they became, later in the later Middle Ages, it became ferrous, and again, it's all about durability and how long lasting it was. And so then you would painstakingly inscribe by hand in beautiful, very regular letters by a trained scribe. But of course, the page would be laid out first. And if there was going to be an illustration, the illustrations, space would be left for the illustrations. An artist would later come and would kind of provide the illustration, and perhaps even illuminate it at some stage in the much later than we're talking about now. You would take liquid metals, gold and silver, etc., and illuminate the page. And then you would bind it up, and you would have a codex. And on the wooden covers of the codex, you would kind of inlay jewels and gold, and you would have this precious kind of artifact. The thing is, in a medieval monastery, I don't think of course, you would have, up to the point of illumination, you would have that document, which is invaluable, which is very expensive, but I don't think has any value to a Viking.
Exactly.
It would be letters on a page, and I don't think that translates into material value for a Viking.
They have to monetize it, so
right.
Ransoming and stuff is, yeah.
When we think of these illuminated manuscripts with bejeweled covers, those are deluxe manuscripts commissioned by a noble, and it would not be housed in a monastic monastery. The books in a monastic monastery would likely serve liturgical uses, or perhaps the uses of students in the monastery. They would be school texts. They would be very utilitarian. I'm not saying they wouldn't be beautiful, but I don't think they would be that lure, so.
The cultural difference too. Go ahead, CJ.
I mean, in everything I've looked at, all the documents that talk about Viking raids on monasteries, we hear about, like Simeon of Durham, for example, who talks about the people being dragged off, the silver being carried away, but they don't mention in the manuscripts at all.
Right.
And I don't know of any mention of, and then the Vikings took away the manuscripts, and it's a Viking who comes in illiterate. I think the most they ever had was runes on a rune stick, right? So they might even
that point.
They might not. They're looking like where are all the sheepskins and what are they doing here?
Going back to my comment about the Library of Alexandria, I love the fact that we in the modern world, looking back on the devastation that that's kind of brought to these communities, monastic communities, or maybe Alexandria at certain times in history, what devastates us is the loss of the wealth of knowledge. That's what kind of devastates us. The dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII, the destruction of monasteries by the French revolutionaries. We think of the lost knowledge. I guess that's a credit to us that's what we are sensitive to. But I think when it comes to the Vikings, they want treasure that can be translated very quickly, that can be converted, I guess is a better word. into more useful money. And lastly, just in line with what CJ was saying, of all the descriptions of the Northmen in the Carolingian world, we don't hear at all about the libraries. We don't hear at all about the books. In fact, what's most interesting, you do hear about treasure, which is really not specified what that is, and people, captives. Captives are mentioned. So, monasteries, and when you asked me to be on this, I thought, well, what do I know? Because here I am trying to hold the Vikings at bay. The real question for me is, were monasteries targeted at all? And that kind of made me reflect on what I know of how they operated in France, at least, in Germany. First of all, monasteries weren't necessarily coastal in 8th and 9th century France. In fact, they were not at all coastal. In Britain, in Ireland, there was a tradition of monasticism that differed from the continent, and it was called peregrination. So monks oftentimes would get in a boat, and we're talking, this is very early Middle Ages. This is almost, time of St. Patrick, who is considered a peregrinator. A peregrination just means a journey, and so in this tradition of monasticism, you would get in a boat or go on a long journey. And honestly, the best way to give your will to God is literally allow God to tell you where you should be. So you get in a boat and you don't even steer it, and just let the current and the wind take you. And where you end up is where God wants you to establish your monastic house. So maybe not surprisingly, early on, at least in the tradition, you have these very remote monasteries in coastal regions. But in France and Germany and Italy, Spain, monasteries had actually long been incorporated into the world, and I go back to, there's a really, when I teach this to students, I always talk about Saint Martin of Tours. Saint Martin of Tours wanted nothing more than to be a monk and a hermit and live in a cave and devote himself to God and live a life of prayer and abstinence. Well, he did this for a few years, and the Bishop of Tours died. And Tours was far to the north of where he was living at the time. And he gets a message, and oh, the people have heard of your great sanctity. Would you consider being our bishop? And Martin of Tours says no, because being a bishop would mean to live the active life, to serve the world, not live the contemplative life. And I want to pray to God. I don't want to be distracted. And so Martin of Tours was not interested. So the people of Tours had to trick him. They sent down another message. The child of one of our prominent citizens is ill. Would you come up and see if you could heal this child? And the moment he stepped through the gates of the city, they proclaimed him bishop. All he wanted to be. In fact, I show this amazing image. It's a stained glass image of the investiture, I guess you call it, of Martin of Tours, and they're putting the mitre on his head, and he looks so miserable. He does not want it, but it's almost he realizes that he can't avoid the active life, and in France, in Italy, Germany, and in the continent at least. And I'm only saying at least because I'm really very unfamiliar with the Anglo-Saxon monastic tradition. But on the continent, monks are forever caught between the world and heaven. They're living on the periphery. It's a liminal existence in some respect. Monks are called to live in the world. That monasteries provide very important services. They are hospitals, they are charitable organizations, they're prisons, they're schools. There's a need in society. Society grows up around a monastery. So when Vikings appeared in France, I don't think they're targeting these communities at all. These communities are simply there alongside villages and alongside cities, and Vikings are indiscriminate. In fact, in every single Carolingian account of the Northmen, the Vikings,
Yeah.
I would say 90% of them are about cities and villages. I've only found, other than Alcuin's discussion of Lindisfarne, I've only seen 2 or 3 where a monastery is specifically mentioned at all. Now, that might simply be the result of the perspective of the author. The author, may not live in a monastic community, or the author's focus may be on worldly events, not necessarily monastic events. And so that's what you see, the king led his armies against so and so. Meanwhile, the Northmen came and attacked this town. That's kind of within that author's perspective. Maybe these monasteries were targeted a lot more than the historical records indicate. But I don't know if they lured the Vikings to them, in that way.
Yeah.
And so really the only piece, and tell me when I'm going on too long, the only real question for me that still remains, yes, they were absolutely attacked. Yes, they were despoiled. Yes, they were plundered. Yes, people were taken captive. But the other assumption I think that we still need to deal with is, were monasteries in any way targeted because this was a community of pacifists?
Okay, wait, hold on before you do that, because actually I have a passage here that just to give our audience an example of what you're just talking about there with these kinds of chroniclers, right, and monastic commentators. And so this is in the mid 9th century, so they've already been hammered for a few decades at this point. But this is in Noirmoutier, and he says, the number of the number of ships grows. The endless stream of Vikings never ceases to increase. Everywhere the Christians are the victims of massacres, burnings, plunderings. The Vikings conquer all in their path, and nothing resists them. They seize Bordeaux, Périgueux, Limoges, Angoulême, and Toulouse, Angers, Tours, and Orléans, and are annihilated, and an innumerable fleet sails up the Seine, and the evil grows in the whole region. Rouen is laid waste, plundered, and burned. Paris, Beauvais, and Meaux taken. Melun's strong fortress leveled to the ground. Chartres occupied. Evreux and Bayeux plundered, and every town besieged. So, I mean, it's like this massive onslaught, but you're right. I mean, they're not really saying, oh, us poor monasteries, they took our things, or in any indication that it's like a specific hit. Yeah.
Yeah, that's later, right? So we have our 3 phases of Viking expansion as outlined by the French historian Lucien Musset. My understanding, so actually Noirmoutier that's my focus. So I look at that. And I like what you said about challenging the assumption that monasteries were definite targets. Particularly since when we're talking about the Viking Age, we're talking about 3 centuries of activity. So it's very easy to just blanket say, hey, this was a phenomenon throughout the 3 centuries. However, early on, the first couple of raids, we start with Lindisfarne, which was a big deal. I always go back to the Anglocentrism of of the study of the Viking Age, because we tend to delineate the Viking Age as starting at Lindisfarne, even though there was a raid at the port of Portland 4 years before in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, and then we end with 1066, the closure of the Viking Age with the Norman invasion of England. So very Anglo-centric. Whereas if we move into France, it's a much different experience, particularly as it pertains to Normandy later. But in the beginning, Noirmoutier is the first place that they supposedly attacked in 799, and there's a very definite progression in those first few years before the year 800. Because we have Lindisfarne in 793, and then in 795 we have Iona, another monastery, but on the other side of the British Isles, kind of north of Ireland, right, northeast. And then after that we have Noirmoutier, which is or Saint-Philbert, which is the monastery there, in 799. what's interesting about Saint-Philbert, and now these are very isolated cases, so can we say that monasteries were the definite target of the Vikings early on? We know there are a lot of other raids outside of the monasteries too, and I can't name them all because they don't all have names. So,
all
but
those arrows on that map.
Yeah, all those arrows, you know.
Yeah.
But what was interesting about Saint-Philbert in particular is by the year 819, we had the abbot. His name was Arnulf, and he wrote a letter to Higgebald, or not Higgebald, to the Archbishop of Salzburg, complaining of frequent and persistent raids. And these raids were so persistent that the monks started abandoning the island. So they actually got a royal charter to establish a satellite priory called Deas on the continent. And they would flee the island in the summer during raiding season, and then go back in the winter.
Smart.
And in 836, they were so plagued. Actually, so back to the were they undefended? In 830, they got a charter from I think it was Pepin of Aquitaine, who allowed them to build a castrum, so basically a fortification around the monastery to defend against the Vikings. It failed. The Vikings took over in 836. The monks left definitively. They went to death. What's stranger is once they did move to the continent, the Vikings followed them. And in the 840s, they went inland and went to death. So there was something, I feel like in that situation, so maybe we can't say, you know, in broad terms, monasteries were the target, but I think it's safe to say that for that small monastery, for some reason, there was a draw. And I guess I would like to hear from you what you think a possible draw in that particular instance might have been. Right.
Oh,
for
I know what you want him to say too. I know.
Well, I want to know what you think he wants me to say, because I haven't even formulated my response to that. You know, the first thing that occurs to me is monks aren't meant to be responsive to the world. You know, that you know, it's not more than an anecdote. It's fascinating that you said they were given a charter to kind of fortify themselves. You know, and practically, you know, in a practical sense, you know, that, you know, is absolutely reasonable. You know, and when I'm talking about monasticism, I'm really talking about monasticism in an idealized way. You know, monks absolutely have to deal with mundane concerns. You know, and the Vikings, that's a very, you know, palpable concern right in front of them, especially if it comes back year after year. And if you read lots of chronicles, it gets to the point. Here's another thing. We also assume that the Vikings are the only ones doing raiding. You know, a lot of the Carolingian chronicles, the annals, you know, they talk about Saracens. They talk about raids from all sorts of different areas. One fascinating thing when it comes to the Northmen or the Vikings is it almost sounds like the chroniclers are just getting a little exasperated and tired of even reporting it. You know, almost as if it's kind of like you said, it's a seasonal thing.
Yeah.
You know, it's kind of like, well, you know, the rains were heavy again this spring. Well, the Vikings returned.
Yeah.
And actually, there is one chronicle that I just recently went back to, and I don't know if it's Xanten or Samberten, but it almost, but we don't even need to go back. We don't even need to go into that. You know what those Vikings do.
One of those actually, there's a comment in it where it says, "Here they are again for their usual surprise attack."
Right.
Actually, I think there's two that are coming to mind. One says, but it doesn't serve us to even go into just how vicious and immoral they were.
The shock and awe is over.
Whether that chronicler was trying to spare the audience, just, you know, the
gory details.
That's possible. But another one, it almost ends with an ellipsis. It's kind of like, and the Vikings came in, well, and it stops.
Yeah.
And then the next entry starts.
Oh no, that guy died. That's what happened right there.
And
You
maybe,
can
maybe
tell.
that's, they are coming. They are
He was
coming.
struck down by.
So I actually have the Annals of St. Bertin right here. And so, like, to your point, in 843, so they talk about Lothar and Louis behaved peacefully, keeping themselves within the boundaries of their own realms, yada, yada. And then suddenly you get Northmen pirates attacked Nantes, slew the bishop and many clergy and lay people of both sexes. They sacked the civitas. Charles went as arranged to meet his brothers.
And
did you just yada yada Viking?
It's almost to the point, and I know there's lots of discussion, and this isn't my world about the Viking invaders, settlers, etc. In England, I know a whole lot more about this with respect to Britain, how they began to stay more permanently. And when I teach this, I make special mention of the fact that, well, they didn't leave and they stayed and they wintered on this island, and and then began to settle permanently. France is different, in a lot of ways. And I don't know whether it still, within the 9th century at least, pretty much stayed at the rating level, and it did become seasonal. And with respect to the frequency in the Annals and Chronicles, it almost became almost not even needing to be said and reported. They're here again. And meanwhile, Charles and his brothers. And then you get paragraph after paragraph of political history. You might get a report on the weather again, and how seasonal or unseasonal so it might be. And then maybe just a line about, and the Northmen again. Yeah. So it's business as usual. Now, it might be easy to kind of skirt over that these entries. What I think it would suggest is these communities are absolutely destroyed. Yep. And people have to flee and people have to rebuild. Perhaps, in the case of towns and cities, I'm sure the rebuilding happened, and people resettled. In terms of monasteries, how many were abandoned as a result of it? And that would be something that I would want to look into more. In terms of a monk's response to it, though, yeah. This is what's fascinating. A monk's response to the Vikings. First of all, do monks put up any resistance at all? We have a sense that monks are non-violent. And there's even a more interesting assumption we have of monks, that they have somehow vowed not to use weapons or bladed weapons. And this goes into, modern day science fiction fantasy and World of Warcraft, and, monk characters, and just what describes a monk. A monk has pledged never to pick up a blade, things like that. There, nowhere in any monastic rule does it say monks can't defend themselves. Nowhere in a monastic rule does it even say, does it specify, monks can't be physically violent. It doesn't specify that because it doesn't need to. A monk shouldn't be given to anger. A monk is to trust in God. So the notion, what happens when monks see Vikings come and enter their community? Can they put up a fight? I think that's kind of interesting. Did they just fall over or flee at the first sign of a Viking? I think most people fled at the first sign of a Viking, not just a monk, a villager. I don't think there's much in the way of a distinction here. I don't think there's anything about a monk that makes a monk more particularly vulnerable than anyone else. Very few people are professional warriors at this time.
My students, this is a common thing. They're always like, well, why didn't the monks just fight back?
Right.
Like, well, they probably did. I mean, they're like anybody else. You sort of get attacked and that's your response, right? Your sort of reflex response is to like try to save your own life if you can. Right. But then there's also the other question too, of which maybe gets to a little bit more about sort of, Francia as a polity, as it were. And that's like, well, why isn't the cavalry coming in to save these institutions, kind of thing. And I mean, my response, when I'll ask you, what's going on there politically, because we know later in the 9th century, like towards the end, all of a sudden we're starting to get Odo and Arnulf or whatever, who are building up, who have enough force to kind of be like, all right, we're clamping down on this. But earlier on, like understanding the nature of what it takes to even have a military force that's sort of on guard, for any possible Viking attack, which were like kind of, I mean, we're talking seasonal stuff, but it's also kind of rando, at times it's unexpected. They were good at surprise attacks, at least initially and stuff. And
I compare it rightly or wrongly. I watched the World Cup this year, and I absolutely love soccer or football. And compared to a lot of other American sports, there are some really intriguing rules when it comes to soccer. You count up, not down. You never know when precisely the match is going to end. And I kind of like that uncertainty. Some of my other friends are just, beside themselves. And a match ends when it ends. Another interesting, rule, you have 90 minutes of play plus you might even have an overtime, and then it's decided by these like some sort of, what do they call it, where there's penalty, they're not penalty kicks, it's a kick out or something like that.
Yeah.
Sure, there's a better name for it. Well, when I'm watching a penalty kick in soccer, I'll just say penalty kick, when I'm watching it, I'm sometimes a little beside myself, simply because these are the best of the best, these goaltenders, these goalkeepers. How do you explain the fact that the best of the best, paid millions of dollars, goes to one side of the net and the ball goes to the other? And I always ask my students this, that you couldn't have saved the ball worse. You are in the opposite side of the net. And of course, the answer is, that goalie cannot wait to see where it's going. If the goalie waits to see where it's going, by the time the goalie moves in that direction, he or she is too late. So you have to predict. And I think in France, initially, if there's any degree of centralization in terms of the military, or even if it's sort of a local militia, you cannot predict where these Vikings are going to attack. And you don't have the resources. So going back to that monastery that got a charter to develop, to fortify itself. Well, that's very unusual, and it's likely because they were right in the way of this route. They are in an island, and that was just kind of, it's not that they had a target on them. It's just they were right on the highway. And every year they were gonna, that was a possibility. So it made sense to kind of devote resources to that one area. But otherwise, I mean, cities were being attacked. So, in terms of priorities, you couldn't just send out roaming armies to kind of hope to intercept, these raiders.
It's expensive.
Oh yeah, it's too expensive, and you can't put garrisons everywhere.
Right.
So I guess they had to wait to find different solutions, but it certainly wasn't in the 9th century that they eventually arrived at it.
I was just going to go back to that charter too, just in terms of the social construct of society at the time, mentioning that the monasteries were landowners, right? So the church was a large landowner, and the local lords, like say for example, we'll just take the Noirmoutier, right? The Count of Nantes, right? It was at the time is Guy de Nantes. He is the Count of Nantes and the Poitou, which is the surrounding region. And the social contract at the time is, we protect peasants who are on our land, but the church wasn't their land, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, but if you take that back to the I don't want to call it the Saracen invasions, but the Muslim invasions of France, going back to Charles the Hammer, right? Yep. The Franks actually didn't lift a finger to defend the country until the church paid them
Right.
because the Muslims were invading church lands, and then they were like, well, that's not our problem, that's your problem, right? And so going back to that charter, it's basically the monks saying, hey, we need help, can you send an army? And actually in 836 the Franks did send an army,
Right.
and they did defeat the Vikings on the island of which I think is 835. But then when the Franks went home, the following month the Vikings came back.
Right.
And they took the island. So yeah, I think there's also political what's the right word, there's a political hurdle to overcome between the church and the landowners, or the Franks, right?
Right.
Well,
secular landholders.
This is the exact kind of thing that we hear about with Vikings, then, isn't it too? That's this exploitation of weakness in that regard, right? Well, while those two are busy squabbling over who's going to protect who, we'll just keep hammering all of them. And
and when it comes to kind of what Vikings were after, and rightly or wrongly, I live in a neighborhood. It's kind of it's an urban neighborhood. It's quite nice. It's very safe. But we have a problem with kind of smash and grab in our vehicles. Every so often, there might be one street in our neighborhood where the cars get targeted. And actually my car got targeted, and I think my wife left her laptop computer in the front seat. Now the car was locked, and I'm sure we didn't intend to kind of leave it there, but the next morning it was still there. The most valuable thing in the car, other than the car itself, first of all, the car itself was still there. And CJ, you kind of reminded me of what really was the treasure in the early Middle Ages. It's the land itself. And the Vikings weren't after that land. They weren't trying to stake a claim, so sure, they can come and then they could go back, but the land is what's valuable, and it could be resettled and reworked. But going back to kind of the car analogy, the computer itself wasn't even taken. What's taken? Change. Change in the glove box. To me, what's valuable is our identification, is any identifying documents and insurance, and of course maybe electronics. Maybe I have a manuscript that I'm about to publish, and that's in the back seat. Well, that's almost like a book in a monastic scriptorium or a library. These people don't want that. They want something that just has immediate value. And to me, it's a pain, by the way. It's a pain to have to repair a window. In fact, I've almost got to the point, and a lot of people in my neighborhood have got to a point, you just leave your cars unlocked.
Yeah.
You leave your cars unlocked at night, and in the morning, your car might be tossed, it might be rummaged through, but really nothing of value is taken. And again, I don't want to make claims I can't back up right now, but just hearing about the Vikings returning and how the chroniclers are describing the Vikings and their activity in France, I almost have to wonder, have they got to the point, or have I gotten to the point that they did? That I know that this is a possible occurrence. I know that, this may be a huge inconvenience. Now, and I shouldn't speak so flippantly of people's lives and people being captured and people, being destroyed, and property being destroyed and people being killed. But from the attitude of a high-ranking official or administrator, where is it best to put our resources? Where is it best? What do we need to protect? What can we do? And I think, the priorities were the most populated of places. We
know sometimes that they in some of the chronicles that they indicate that, attempts to hide the goods in anticipation of them coming. So I'm sure, like, say to some of the less valuables, we'll just set it out on the front porch and leave it there for, I think you're right. You sort of have to start making those decisions. And the exasperation, I can imagine, is you're just tired of it, right?
So I do have a follow-up question, and this goes back more toward the beginning of the conversation as it pertains to the precious metals for all of the items that were used in prayer, liturgy, etc. So one of the arguments that I like to make is, for these repeated raids, they must have been looking for something specific, something that wasn't bodies, because they were abandoning the island in the summer. So this is this is the example in Nomuche where the repeated raids. So if they're coming back year after year, you'd think the monks would start getting wise to this, kind of like you with your car, don't leave any valuables in there. So they'd take all the valuables back to the mainland, they'd take all the people back to the mainland, and so there would really not be anything for the Vikings to find there other than, or was there something else? And then going back to your assertion that land is the real value to the monks. So how crucial would all of these, say, silver goods for their religious practice have been? And so, because I always think of it as like, surely they wouldn't be stupid enough to replenish a monastery full of silver every year. But if it was important enough for them to go back to this valuable land, to rework the land, but while they're there, they have to have these things in order to lead their monastic life. Could you speak a little bit to that as like the centrality of those things?
Yeah. So, I was gonna make another analogy. I've decided I'm gonna leave my car alone. Yeah, I think when it comes to the liturgy, there are items that are just indispensable that you absolutely have to have, that you need to restock, that you cannot do without. It I during now we're going to Tudor times. Now we're going to King Henry VIII, and I'm just thinking about how the church was changed and transformed in that time, from Henry VIII to Edward to Mary and to Elizabeth. Churches within 60 years had to divest themselves of all their treasures, reacquire it, get rid of it. Maybe, the thing is, when it comes to Roman Catholic worship, there are things that are necessary. There are, you need altars. One thing I didn't mention that had a tremendous amount of value, both spiritually and just materially, were reliquaries. Reliquaries, a lot of these monastic foundations are there because of the saints, and in fact, the acquisition of relics and the veneration of relics was a very important part of monastic life. It attracted pilgrims to many monastic centers, and so it was a potential revenue source in some ways, if you want to consider it that. Yeah. So relics would not, you would not kind of bury a relic. That's the whole point, is a relic is there to kind of provide a meaningful channel, between that might elevate you in prayer. So they are meant to be venerated, and meant to be displayed, but at the same time, you treat a relic with great respect, and you encase a relic in a reliquary, precious metals. So these would also be something, it's the reason why some monasteries are even there at all. So I don't think, if monks return to a community, would they be wise enough to not bring back the wealth, maybe just sort of leave it aside? I think they have to. If you want to live as a monk, they didn't see this as material wealth, hard to come by, of course. They saw it as indispensable to their lives. So the vessels used in the liturgy, relics would be, I wish I had more evidence that might suggest, were any relics taken by Vikings unknowingly, simply because they would at least look in physical appearance to be a little treasure box. That's kind of the appearance of them.
In Nomuche, they supposedly they left it. So the body was left at the monastery, and then the Vikings didn't take the bones. They took all the other stuff. Right. And then when they moved to the mainland in 836, they brought the relics with them to the satellite priory in Mondias.
Yeah, let's just to be clear for our maybe some in our audience who don't understand what a reliquary is, right? It's generally a container that has the relics of a saint. someone who's being venerated in the Roman Catholic tradition, and oftentimes it's the bones or a
Yeah,
bone.
and it could be any object associated. It provides kind of a tangible sign of God's grace on earth, whether it's through the activity of a man or a woman, whether it's a special object associated with a woman. I talked about Martin of Tours. Well, one of the most famous relics in all of France is Martin of Tours, when he was a soldier, was entering a city, I think it was Amiens, and he saw a beggar at the side of the road, and that beggar was shivering. And so Martin actually took his officer's cloak and he ripped it in half and he gave it to the beggar. And that became like what a demonstration of Christian charity. And the kings of France, actually, because St. Martin became quite prominent, the kings of France desired that relic, Martin's cloak, and they kept it in their personal chapel. And actually the word capella, meaning cloak, is where we get the word chapel today. So, so any special object. And when I talk about relics to my students, I think about, even, if I'm walking the streets of Philadelphia or Washington, D.C., or if I'm in a holy place or Jerusalem, if I'm walking in the same place of a very significant person, it connects me more to their lives, connects me more to what was important in their lives. Sometimes just to kind of, underline the point a little bit, I say, I teach in an American university, John Hancock. Who's John Hancock? And of course, no one really knows who John Hancock is. And I show them the Declaration of Independence. And, John Hancock has the biggest signature, on that declaration. And I said, well, what if I said to you right now, I have John Hancock's pen. Do you want to like pass it around? Well, that's kind of cool, to kind of have a piece of history in your hand. It really kind of connects you with that moment. Well, a relic kind of connects you with the sanctity of an individual and might inspire your kind of spiritual life in a way that you might not otherwise be able to. So, that's why people sought relics, and monasteries were an ideal place to reposit a relic, because a monk was devoted to prayer. And, in addition to singing the Psalms daily, monks would pray for the dead, and monks would kind of keep the memory of these individuals alive. But there was that, added bonus. Having a relic oftentimes made a monastery a place of pilgrimage. And I'm fascinated by medieval architecture and ecclesiastical architecture. And what even happens architecturally, if you've ever been in a large Gothic cathedral, and you see all these altars that kind of are right down at the eastern end of a church. They're secondary altars. But the choir of the monks is almost shut off right in the middle. These would be monastic communities that had jobs to do.
Yeah.
But they would have pilgrims that would just kind of circle the outside altars, because they couldn't have their prayers interrupted. They couldn't have the divine office, the work of God, interrupted. But these pilgrims brought a great amount of business to these communities and donations. So, reliquaries, that these treasures were part of the monastic experience. And
sorry about that.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so the precious nature of these things that you're talking about, and especially because we're talking about the 8th and 9th century, and this is when, this is prior to Scandinavia becoming Christian. And so, I mean, to me, it kind of highlights an interesting, with these idea of the hits on the monasteries, intentional or not, of just the culture clash, right? Because clearly the monks and the faithful saw all of these things as very necessary, as you say. I mean, you got to have a chalice and a paten, you got to have a pyx, you got to have, your reliquary, all that stuff. It's going to get replenished. These things are important to us. They're precious to us. And yet for the Vikings, it's like they're driving up to the ATM. They don't care, right? They're just like, give me the stuff. I need it to monetize. And then it sort of also begs the question of, is it purely that, or is it also like, oh, I'm taking this because I know it's precious to you? And there's some level of kind of terror that is conveyed.
Well, and you raise a really interesting point. The fact that these are pagans, to a Christian monk, these are pagans, and how terrifying, that clash of culture. Well, monks in the 8th century, 9th century, they reminisced. They were nostalgic about the way monasticism used to be practiced. And the way monasticism used to be practiced is monasticism wasn't easy. Monasticism wasn't some lifestyle where like it's moving to a commune and growing collective food and living a life of peace. Monasticism was a risky prospect. It was meant to challenge you, and honestly, if it resulted in your death or martyrdom, that's almost the point. Monasticism in a lot of ways is a metaphorical death. You can't kind of speed up. Be like, this isn't the age of gladiators and Christian persecution. In fact, monasticism is, almost a result of the fact that that Christians aren't living in an age of persecution anymore. So what do I have to do to sacrifice myself? Because Jesus made the ultimate sacrifice. Jesus died for his faith, and I want to emulate Christ, and I'm called to emulate Christ, but I can't die for my faith. But, well, I could die to the world, and that's what monasticism is. Well, monasticism, is meant to be challenging. There's a reason why, in some ways, Charlemagne used monasticism as a way to subdue pagan populations, to extend control. Armies couldn't, conquer for him. Charlemagne tried year after year after year to subdue the Saxons, and just unsuccessfully. Ultimately, Saxony was brought into the empire because Charlemagne encouraged monasteries to be developed and established. And it wasn't a peaceful experience. It was a challenging experience. And I'm sure there were a lot of martyrs made. This is an era of missionaries going into, going into kind of very dangerous scenarios. And again, this is sometimes what people feel called to do. The whole definition of a vocation, of a monastic vocation, is it's meant to be challenging. It's not meant to kind of encourage the status quo, and when people, I'd like to think, and we could talk about monastic recruitment if we have time, and just who were monks, because I'm talking about an ideal. But if anyone is considering a monastic vocation, I don't think they're looking for Club Med. I don't think they're looking for a resort. They're looking for something different, something challenging, something risky that will enable them, maybe even accelerate them and fast track them to their eternal reward. And so I'm not saying monks welcomed the Vikings and saw them as, the kind of an opportunity for martyrdom, but I think maybe some of them anyways accepted it as part. Maybe this is a reason why they went back, that if this is what God calls them to do, and if this is what God sees as how they should live their lives, they should trust in God. And that's what Alcuin, going back to his letter, he advises his monks to do, not his monks, he advises the monks of Britain to do two things: to defend themselves. He says that, defend themselves, to take confidence, to defend themselves and trust in God. And it's really interesting what the defend themselves means. Is he saying pick up a staff and hit them with it? Or does he mean kind of like morally defend yourself and spiritually defend yourself? I find it fascinating. I think monks might have the human response and may kind of put up their hands and try to shield themselves from violence, but also that there's this trust in God, and trust in God, I don't think necessarily means God's going to keep you alive to the ripe old age of 90. Trust in God is that God has a plan. And,
I think Alcuin, well, I always sort of liken the, his letter for me is always a little bit of blame the victim kind of. I think
yes,
defend
absolutely.
yourself means shame on you, be better Christians.
Yeah. I did pick up on how he sees that this is a direct response to,
you brought this on yourself.
Right. He does that. He does. Well, so to bring it back to Vikings, this has been a really interesting conversation because I had a little bit of an aha moment. I'm not going to speak for Lindisfarne or Iona or any of the other monasteries. I'm going to bring it back to Saint-Philbert in France specifically, and because it is a curious case because it was attacked repeatedly so many times. But we established through this conversation that the value or the valuable things about a monastery from the Christian perspective or the monk's perspective is, number one, the land that needs to be worked, right? Because it takes a tremendous amount of labor and land ownership to produce these manuscripts. Number two is the manuscripts themselves. Those are valuable. And number three is relics. And as we've also established, those three things are not what the Vikings are after. The Vikings are after portable wealth. Hopefully, so Soren Sindebæk, who's an archaeologist, I think he's at Aarhus University right now. He has done a tremendous amount of work on the silver economy in Scandinavia at the outset of the Viking Age. So silver, we know, was incredibly important to them. So if they could find portable wealth, specifically silver, that was their favorite. And going back to the idea of like the monks brought in all of these silver items for their rituals and for their daily, religious practices, but on our list of three, those things didn't really feature. They're there, but they're like fourth place, right? Mm-hmm. So in my mind, I'm thinking there's almost this scenario where in Saint-Philbert it could have just been a perfect storm where the monks would go back to the monastery every year. They'd bring back their silver to do their practices. For them, they would go back because it was to save the manuscripts, save the relics, and work the land. And then when the Vikings would come, they would leave, but they would leave the silver behind, thinking that's low on our priority list. Let's take the manuscripts and the relics and the people and leave. Right. But what they're inadvertently doing was leaving the thing that was most valuable to the Vikings behind. Right? Yeah. Like, but because of the cultural difference, they couldn't see it.
Yeah, it almost like it's almost as if they're renting, their land from the Vikings or leaving them tribute.
By total accident.
They were no strangers to tribute extorting. Let me say that. Wherever
I could just imagine the monks sitting down and going, "Why do they keep coming back? We don't leave anything valuable for them."
Right.
Although the Vikings, until you get until the 10th century, then they're going to be about the land.
Right. Well, I'm just thinking really early on, then the Vikings keep showing up, going kind of like how Rainer, when we had our conversation with William Short and Rainer Oskarsson, right? And Rainer, he's just what idiots! They just left all the silver behind. Let's come back and do this again.
I guess Vikings are obviously looking for portable wealth.
Yeah.
Another thing I kind of picked up from a lot of continental sources is, I don't know if monasteries weren't exactly centers of trade. The villages and cities were. I think there's a lot more portable wealth there than that would be in a monastery, especially if these specific monks are actually taking the liturgical vessels with them. Presumably they would, or hopefully they would, if they're getting kind of a jump start on the raiding season and they're managing to escape their community. What I think they would leave behind, though, are lots of provisions. And I saw in a lot of sources, the Vikings are plundering. Yeah, we think of silver and gold, and absolutely, I'm sure that was, they were overjoyed to find it. But food, what enables them to continue their raids, that would absolutely be, it would be a necessity for them. They cannot transport, they cannot take with them everything they need for the season. They have to kind of almost establish a supply chain and go from port to port or place to place. and get food and drink and necessities that would allow them to maybe kind of continue on to more desirous targets.
Do you
You know,
think one of the parts of those food resources would have been salt?
you know, I remember listening to somebody's paper that talked about a monastic inventory, and we just assume that monks in their you know, their larder would just be filled with the most basic of staples, which to me would still, I think, be important to Vikings, you know, just to have very basic provisions. Um, and but it's amazing what monks actually had, even the most remote communities. You know, I can't afford saffron at my grocery store, you know, but they had spice. I'm not saying they had saffron. I seem to remember something almost so, you know, very expensive in one of these monastic inventories. I was just shocked. I was just shocked, you know, that this would be kind of in some remote place in Northern Europe. Um, yeah, I think, you know, I think monasteries, if monasteries were in some sort of direct route that would be used by Viking raiders, well, this would almost be, you know, not a fast food place, but this would be a place to stay. There would be shelter, there would be food, you know, if there was silver, great. And honestly, I think if monks are taking liturgical vessels with them, I don't think they're going to leave silver. I think they're going to do their best to take, you know, what is most valuable, but they're not going to take flour, milled flour. They're not going to take perishable goods. But I think to a Viking, this would be very important.
Well, that's part of the research that I've done is in Noirmoutier, it's a salt producing island.
Is it okay? Okay.
Salt would have been a very important commodity to ship out. And there's a study that just came out that showed that the herring trade started maybe 3-4 centuries as early as you know, the 700s, as opposed to where it was previously thought that didn't really start in the Baltic until, you know, 4 or 5 centuries later. And so herring is a very fatty fish, and how you preserve it is in salt, right? Because before, you know, I have a friend in Denmark, and I was telling him about the whole salt thing. He's like, but look, 50 kilometers in any direction. I'm in Denmark, 50 kilometers in any direction, and it's ocean. I don't need salt. And if we're fishing cod, we dry it. But with the herring, it adds a little extra layer to that, where they would have to salt it. Well, and then salt is just a good commodity to have in general. So salt and wine. So those would have been things that they could have taken back. But to your point about the supply line, we do see that in Ireland. So Ireland's experience of the Viking Age is unique insofar as they are the first place where Vikings started landing and staying with, and because the Irish at the time lived insularly, so they lived on inland, they weren't really on the coast. Vikings just started setting up what we call long ports along the edge, and that's the supply line that is thought to have led Vikings into Western France.
Interesting.
Without
really
having to go through the English Channel. Because going through, so if I'm a Norwegian and I try to go through the English Channel, a Danish ship is just going to sink me. They didn't like each other. In fact, in the annals of, or actually the annals of St. Bertin, I actually flipped to like 853, and they talked about the Viking Civil War between the Norwegians and the Danes.
Oh, really?
Allowed Franks to push them out. So we know they didn't like each other necessarily, or didn't always play nice, even within their own, you know, their own groups. But yeah, so the salt thing's a lot of.
Well, I'm glad that kind of corroborates some of my suppositions. Yeah, salt, you know, would have had immense value as a commodity, as a preservative. You know,
I do have a question on. So we mentioned, so like kind of like Saint-Philbert, they have the monastery, and then there's a village around it, and so the monks weren't farming salt, we don't think, especially since when the monks abandoned the island, we can trace the export of salt from the island to other places in the Carolingian Empire. So someone was still there producing it. So there must have been some kind of population present on the island. But it's insofar as the economy of a monastery, I'm curious to know more about the trade networks between the monasteries, how those might have functioned, how much contact they might have had, because they, like you said, they're supposed to be satellite. I don't want, you know, they're supposed to be distant and far away and disconnected, but were there connections between them specifically for trade?
That's a really interesting question. I've never considered the only type of monastery to monastery kind of interaction I've looked at is intellectual. So in the 9th century, abbots would correspond with each other, would request books from their respective libraries so that they could acquire missing texts. They know that Jerome wrote 4 volumes of a particular commentary on scripture, but they only have 2. Well, do you have this one? Could you send it to me so I can make a copy? Or, so there was an intellectual network between monastic communities, but precisely because monasteries were the schoolhouses and libraries of the early Middle Ages. So that would account for that direct connection. But in terms of, I don't know if you're referring more specifically to commodities and necessities, daily necessities. I wouldn't see traffic directly between monasteries. I would see them more between monasteries and cities. I don't think a monastery was ever far away from a city if it wasn't right in the middle of a city. What you see, I mentioned before how monks even in the Rule of Saint Benedict, the author of the Rule laments, well, back in the age of giants, this is what monks were able to do, but we poor incapable individuals living so far away, this is the best we can do. It was almost an excuse for why the monastic life wasn't as vigorous in the Middle Ages as it was in late antiquity. Well, what's interesting in the 8th and 9th century, you see the same thing. Monasteries are not supposed to be near people. There's that understanding. Monks would have been familiar with, the meaning of their vocation, the solitary life, and yet here they are in the middle of the city. The abbot sending them out to the market, or the abbot sending them out over here or there, or they have to take a message here, or the abbot's not there because the abbot's involved, and the abbot needs to, counsel somebody. The town and the monastery, that gate would be, I'm not saying it was, a place of constant transit, but it would be frequently used. These were not cloistered communities physically. A monastery was a very lively place. Some monasteries, most monasteries would only have a few dozen monks. So it might be very small, but the largest monasteries would number up to 400 people. There's a few accounts of monasteries where there's 300 or 400 monks living there. It is a city, and in order for a city to run itself, you need help from the outside. You need people from the town who actually are employed there. They can't disturb the lives of monks. They need to respect monks, but they're necessary to the kind of the livelihood of this community. So monasteries are even moving from their ideal location. So a lot of monasteries, especially the ones called St. Michael, monasteries that are named in honor of St. Michael are meant to be on mountaintops. We think of Mont Saint-Michel, St. Michael's Mount. Lots of St. Michael's originally started on mountaintops. I'm sure there's lots in Greece as well. They're meant to be remote. But the thing is, that's not helping the monks, and it's not helping society. And so we actually have so many accounts of monks moving closer to the world, moving closer to the rivers, moving closer to the towns, so that they could access the resources they need, and they could provide the resources that they provide. So these are not isolated communities at all. They're very much kind of a part of the world. So in terms of where would they be accessing goods, and would there be any kind of correspondence between monasteries? I don't know if there would be that correspondence in terms of kind of basic necessities. I think it was more kind of an intellectual transit or network that existed in on the continent.
So they weren't like a mafia, right? Where it's just like, well, we'll trade between each other, and then and then people would come out and be like, I live in this village, and go, oh, I heard the monastery has saffron.
I'm not shutting down that thesis just because it sounds so provocative. So now I kind of want to. Well, you know what? I'll withhold my judgment a little bit. I'm just not aware of those connections.
Well, we're at an hour and a half, so I want to be mindful of Matt's time here, and so I think maybe what have we concluded here, that the lure of the monasteries, maybe in some places there was lure, but in the Frankish monasteries they were just there, and it was sort of collateral damage, and it
may have been accidental.
Yeah, exactly, accidental, and they're just like taking where they can take, and sometimes it just happens to be a monastery. So yeah, we got a whole new thesis going on here.
Yeah, and I haven't thought of any concluding words. I don't think you need to change the title at all. I think, yeah, there was a lure. But I think the lure was and a very distinct one, but it was they had multiple, draws.
Yeah.
The village had its draw, the city had its draw. It was all on their kind of route. It was they didn't have to limit themselves. I don't think the Carolingians did not know how to deal with them, and they kind of put up with it. They almost acclimatized themselves to it. It was devastating and tragic, and any intellectual discussion may not acknowledge kind of the human part of it, and so I don't want to dismiss just how devastating and tragic it was. But so when I say kind of they acclimatized themselves to it, I think they did learn to kind of live with the prevalence of it, and it wasn't inevitable. It was a little more random. And I think monasteries were just kind of Vikings were opportunistic, and they held a great deal of kind of attraction to them. They had treasure. And the treasure existed in many forms, and monks might have prioritized it differently from the Vikings, but it was definitely there. And so I don't think monasteries would have walked by or traveled by them without seeing if they had anything of value.
And I very much
go ahead.
Yeah, I very much appreciate that right off the bat you called into question this focus that we have on the Viking side, or at least as Viking historians, is this idea that monasteries were a target specifically more than other targets. Whereas one of the reasons we believe that is because of people like Alcuin, Simeon of Durham, the chroniclers. That's their initial victims. They wrote about it, but we don't, going back to the literacy rates, right, of the time in Anglo-Saxon England, or even in France, they would have been very low. So a small village getting attacked wouldn't have featured on the map. And then going back to that delineation between, the church being a land, or the monasteries being landowners, and there's the secular landowners. And so you get a small village somewhere that, they can't write it down. So we never hear about them, right? And back to your point, Terry, that you've made, I think every episode so far, and it's a really good one, is that the Vikings were opportunists in the extreme. So being very careful of saying, yes, they did go after monasteries as a target, but can we say that they went after monasteries more than other things? I don't think we can say that.
Right. I agree. All right. Amen. Well, thank you, Matt. This has been great. Do you have anything that you're working on that you'd like to plug, or?
Oh, what am I plugging right now? I have a book coming out. It's just like I said, my academic focus was accidental. This project was a little bit accidental. It's a critical edition and translation that I'm doing in collaboration with a scholar named James Lepre in New York. But it's a critical edition of a political treatise that was written ostensibly for Louis the Pious. It's little known because this political treatise, Advice for Kings, simply because it appears very, very, not derivative, but uninspired. but we kind of reconsider this text and kind of see it having its place kind of within, you know, the kind of the Western tradition of political thought. So yeah, and the only connection it has to my monastic interest, it's an odd treatise written by the abbot that I began my kind of studies in. So an abbot of a very not remote monastery, but a very small monastery. He moved his monastery from a mountain. The monastery was called St. Michael. He moved it closer to the river. It's near Verdun. And he wrote a variety of texts, wrote a commentary on the Rule of St. Benedict, wrote commentaries on the Psalms, but he involved himself in the political life of the empire and wrote this book of advice for Louis the Pious. So it's called the Via Regia, and it's being published by Dallas Texts and Translation. And so that should be coming out later this year. So I actually had something to plug.
Nice. That sounds interesting. We'll look forward to that. And then everyone
when it comes out, shoot us a link.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely.
Shoot us a link. Yeah. And then everyone can also find you on Instagram at Medievalist Matt.
Yeah. So if you want to know kind of the madness behind what method I have, you can go to my random Instagram page. So.
It's always good for a laugh.
Yeah, if you want to laugh. Hopefully there'll be a laugh waiting for you. So
yep, great. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was a delight. I love talking to you, and thanks for the opportunity of maybe kind of confronting a subject that I've always kind of held at arm's length. So I know it was more enjoyable than I could ever have thought it would be. No, I really enjoyed it. So
well, thank you very much for allowing us to force this on you like a real Viking.
Right.
Yeah, like a real Viking.
Yeah.
All right. Have a great afternoon.
Yeah, you too. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.